For coming for today's workshop. This is the first specialized workshop after our introductory session on oral presentations. And I'm delighted to see such a great audience for our session on preparing for the thesis event. Today's workshop director is Dr. Matt Havantropoulos, who is a graduate, PhD graduate of the Department of Neurobiology and Behavior here. And he was a postdoc and now an employee in the Division of Teaching Excellence and Innovation as a STEM specialist. He's helped us a lot over the years with GPS STEM, referring people, helping us out directly. And this is, I think, the first chance to lead a workshop. So I'm really excited and thank you for taking the time.
Well, thank you. And also GPS STEM, or back then GPS Biomed, gave me so much because I was part of the initial cohort that came in, and just everything that all the programming that I've gone through, it brought me to where I am today. So y'all are in a great program here to further your professional career. It's my pleasure to talk to you about delivering the thesis talk. I gave my talk back in 2018, and just to give you a little bit of context, I was recently a judge for the Postdoc Association, where I judged people on their talks. That was a lot of fun, and definitely saw that this sort of professional development is much needed. So I'm glad to be here to help y'all out with this. Also, for my thesis talk, I actually won a professional pre-doctoral award for the talk itself. And so I'll talk to you about some of the strategies that I use to give that talk. And hopefully you can apply it to your own preparation as well. And if you have any questions, I am on campus, but you can always feel free to email me. I'll also stick around afterwards for a few minutes before running back and trying to rearrange a dusty old closet that is going to become my office. So feel free to hang around if you'd like to do that. Also, if you see me going back here a bit and looking at my tablet, I'm not checking my email. I just have my presentation plan and slides here so that I can make sure that we are on track for completing the workshop on time. All right. So we've got 3 goals that we'll hit today. The first is to think about storytelling and about how important storytelling is when framing any sort of talk, but particularly a thesis talk when you really want to talk about something that is so niche that people who aren't in your field might not be familiar with a lot of the work that you've done. So we'll talk about storytelling a little bit. We're also going to talk about pitfalls that I've seen, that I've done in giving thesis talks. And then lastly, we're going to identify practices for preparing and delivering these talks in an effective way. So I've got a warm up for you. Those of you who were here before the intro will know that this is a workshop, so you will be talking to some people. And so what I'd like you to do is to, if you're not already sitting next to someone, you can either turn around, see people around you. If you so choose, you could shout across rows, whatever you want. But I'd like you to pair up, and I'd like you to discuss these 3 questions. What was the greatest story that you read or watched or listened to? It could be a podcast, it could be a book, it could be a movie. It doesn't matter the topic. Any story that you found particularly captivating, think about that. And what I'd like you to do is to describe to your partner what that story was, just in maybe 3 or 4 sentences, and then what made that story so great. So you've got about, I'll give you a little less than 10 minutes to get this done. Does anybody have any questions about the instructions? All right, go for it. I'm going to walk around and eavesdrop on you, but feel free to start.
I don't know if it's even great memories, but like the
Super exciting.
it was like.
Okay, so what made it so great?
And yeah, I was like. Yeah, it's kind of a lot of times, I don't understand because I know you actually have yeah, the great one, yeah, you know, but normally just like what I try to answer and then yeah, especially it's like
I'll just the other way. It's a very. About 5 more minutes, any questions?
So yeah, that's not, I don't know whether to go either, but it's just, yeah, I was saying. That's all. The way that I say, okay. I know you guys don't have enough time. Funny, I got first. And then like. So I'm like, what should I do? That's why
All right, so is anybody willing to share either what story you thought of or your partner thought of that was so enticing that you decided to choose it for this this little warm-up activity? And what made it so great? Let's go for it.
So I talked to Vinny here and he was talking about this show called Money Heist, I believe that was the name of the show. And it was about like armed bank robbers and like the police who were trying to catch them. And I think the interesting part of what he told me, because I'd never seen the show, is that both sides are kind of made to be portrayed as protagonists in a way where you can sort of see where both sides are like coming from. And I don't think I want to spoil anything about the show. But yeah, I think it's just sort of showing how like the characters are, they're not just simple, it's not as simple as just like good and bad, like both sides have, I guess, qualities of each other.
Okay, so the show is called Money Heist, and the attributes were that you get to see both sides as protagonists. You get to learn the context around both sides, and maybe that makes the relationship a little bit more nuanced as the show goes on. I love those, and it actually has anybody here played God of War Ragnarok recently? Okay, so see if you've not. There's a line in there. You don't need to know anything about the story to understand it, but he's talking. There's a god there who's talking about a war that's going on, and the son is saying, "Oh, did we actually do the right thing by helping this group?" And the god says, "You're asking the wrong question." And then the father jumps in and says, "The right question is, are there any good sides in this war?" Right? And it's kind of a similar thing where if you have this oftentimes when we watch movies or series, you have this one perspective, but seeing the other side adds a lot of that context and that story that can make the story a little bit richer. Cool, thank you. Anyone else? It's a hard one to follow. Yeah, go for it.
We each had different stories that we thought of that we liked, but something we found in common in the ones that we brought up is that they have like a very descriptive and emotional terms. And so Isra and I both were thinking of podcasts, and Liz had a book. So you have to like have your own mental image. There's not pictures, there's no like characters that you can see, or I mean like in a book, voices that you could hear. And then also having a good hook. So for the podcast I was thinking of specifically, it starts like, I know the title and it starts off with a story that I don't understand how we'll relate back to the title, but over time it just kind of unfolds, and like at the end you realize how it was all connected.
Just out of curiosity, what is the title of that podcast?
I don't remember.
Or do you know like what company or entity?
It was NPR, like one of their spin-off podcasts.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay, cool. So having that hook, and then having that emotional and descriptive context, because with things like audio, sometimes when you're reading a book, you know, you can read like a comic or something like that, and you've got pictures in there, but oftentimes you have to conjure those images in your head. And so to have that sort of descriptive tactic is in and of itself an art in order to perfect that and get people actually seeing what you want them to see without having visuals, which is very difficult. Cool, thank you. And I swear both of those were not planted in any way, but I do want to talk about some aspects of each as we move on to the next part. So we're going to talk about the importance of storytelling and how storytelling can be used, and specifically about scientific storytelling, which is oftentimes lost. Like if you go to a very scientific talk and people are talking about all of these, I don't know, immunoglobulins that they've discovered and blah, 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 like it's really easy to get lost in the details, right? And I'll give you an example of what that looks like later on. But to make things more accessible to everybody, which your thesis defense, by the way, it's a public defense, you have to cater it so that you're not talking with people in your lab, right? You're talking to other people who might not be in your field, other people who might not be scientists even. I know at my public defense, I actually had some people there who they were just like, oh, well, I was in the area and I heard of this talk. And I was like, all right. But they weren't even scientists. They just wanted to stop by and see what was going on in the realm of neuroscience. And so they stopped in. And so to be able to cater to those different audiences is walking a very fine line between too much information and too little. So when we think about stories, here are the 4 things that came to mind when I was thinking about what is the importance of stories, or what is the function. And the first is we want to persuade people of something. Right? We have an idea, we have and remember, you're defending, right? You're defending your thesis, you're defending your work. You want to persuade, especially your committee, but everybody that you've got this specific idea and that you have the data to back it up. It also brings context. So we're talking here about money heist, right? Money heist, and how the importance of context can really lend itself to a good story. You're providing interaction. And now maybe at a thesis defense, although I have seen it before, but at a thesis defense, you're not going to have some sort of an icebreaker or things like that like we had here. That would be a little strange. I've seen it, but not often. But you can at least have your audience interact with you, interact with the data in a way that just doesn't have them sitting there looking at the clock, waiting to leave, right? So we want to have them interact with the story in some way, shape, or form. And then the last is that it's memorable. I did not see anybody looking up like the main points of that warm-up question, right? You didn't have to look up, oh, what was it about this story that made it so compelling? You just knew because it was just that memorable. When we think about these talks and these defenses, that's something that you want people to walk away with, because not only could it, for example, like in my case, it actually led to this position that I have right now. There were people there from the DTI who were interested in at least interviewing me for a postdoc, but I didn't know it at the time. But you also can have other things that need to be memorable, for example, for like collaborations. Like that. So if we think about these good storytellers and all of the things that you all had mentioned, these are the things that I think storytellers do, which make them particularly effective. The first is that they connect with the audience. The second is that they know a little bit about a lot and a lot about a little. And what I mean by that is you are the sole expert in your thesis. Not even your PI knows as much as you do about the thesis, right? You were the one who did the experiments, you came up with the hypotheses for the most part. You troubleshot everything, you wrote the dissertation, you're the one who did all of that work. Nobody else in the world knows your data like you do. And because of that, you know a lot about very, very little. The example I like to give is, so I when I finished my PhD, I went to a talk that my PI was giving afterwards, and my 3 years of hard work was summarized in 1 slide. I was like, that's all I get is 1 slide in your grand talk of synaptic zinc, and I was like, no, whatever. At least I contributed. But we're just that small slice of the pie. However, if you ask me questions about almost anything related to my thesis, like, oh, why did you choose synaptic zinc? Or what about these other ions? Or what about like, tell me something about Alzheimer's or whatever. I'm not an expert in any of those things, but I know enough to provide context for what I do know. And so knowing a little bit about a lot can definitely help, because when you get those questions, you can, and we'll get to this later, but having that I don't know answer is going to be very important, especially when it comes to the thesis. And if you have hecklers like I did, it becomes even more paramount that you actually can handle them really well. Take control of the room. One of the key things that I do there is, for example, here I arrived here 20 minutes early. I checked the tech. I checked and made sure everything was good. I knew where all the buttons are, what they did, so that if I needed to, and thank you, by the way, for lowering the lights. But if I needed to lower the lights or do something on Zoom or whatever, I know exactly how to do it. I don't want to appear that I don't. And then speak less and speak slowly. So if you think about, I'll just give you an example. Last week, I told you I was a judge for the Postdoc Association. They were, and to give you some context, they were there to compete by talking about their doctoral or their postdoc work. They had 10 minutes to present and have a Q&A. This one person was there, she's not here, but so this one person was there, and she started off really well, pace herself. She was walking around. And then at about the 5-minute mark, she went and she checked the watch. She's like, oh, like there was like an audible sort of like exasperation in her voice. And she just sped through the rest, like, and I was trying to judge, and I was like, I can't write comments fast enough because she's just like, it was just rapid fire coming out of her mouth. And so when we think about, and I'll give you strategies of how to do this, but when we think about the story of your thesis, of your experiments, we want to think about what pieces of data will actually help you tell the story and which ones might not need to tell. And we'll talk about strategies for how exactly to do that. If you're interested, I was listening to a podcast, also I swear it was not planted, but I was listening to a podcast on charisma. And they had talked about these two resources here. And I listened to interviews that both of these people gave on charisma and the science behind it. And all of this is based in social sciences, but there's just so much that we can learn about effective communication that will make you a more effective speaker, not just for your thesis, but for talks in general. Okay, so when I think about a timeline for delivering talks, I normally break down a talk into 4 specific phases. The first is the research phase, and this is the long-term prep, and we're going to go through each of these phases individually. The second is what I call the short-term prep. This is if we are using the story as our metaphor here. This is the prologue. This is what comes before the main event. And then we've got the actual story. This is your thesis, your delivery day. And then we have what I like to call the post-delivery prep, which is the epilogue. So after you say, oh, I'd like to thank my dog and blah, 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 all that stuff. That part immediately afterwards, people don't tend to prepare for. And I'll give you some tips on how to prepare for that so that you can make your impression even longer lasting and to handle, for example, the Q&A portion or any other things that'll come after your defense very well. So we'll start with the longer term prep. Okay, so the timeline here is days to months before the talk. You could do years, but at that point, you're probably just still getting into the thick of things. Here are some common pitfalls for this sort of long-term prep phase. The first is too much information, thinking that every single experiment that you've done needs to find a slide in your dissertation. Going back to my postdoc talk judging thing that I was telling you about, it's a 10-minute talk. I saw and I watched about 25 postdocs give their talks. At least 20 of them had 30 slides or more. 30 slides for a 10-minute talk. But how does that even work? And so we don't want to have all of that information on there because it's just not needed. You can't condense 3 to 6 years of your work down into a 60-minute talk and fit everything in them. You need to pick and choose. If you read from your slides or have too much text, don't do it. If you don't prepare for that post talk, also a pitfall. We'll go over strategies for how to do that. So when I think about this longer term prep, like for example, when I was preparing for this talk, I wanted to think, well, what is the format? Is this going to be an in-person talk? Is it going to be hybrid? Is it going to be online? Each one of those requires a different set of prep steps. And I'm giving another talk couple weeks, I think, about how to give hybrid or Zoom talks, which is completely different from an in-person. What is the timeline? How much time do you have? One of the first questions when David asked me to do this talk that I had was, how much time do I have? Because even though we had blocked off an hour, I wasn't sure if I wanted to talk for the full hour, if I needed to leave room for Q&A, if there was going to be an intro, maybe we were going to wait 5 minutes for people to come in very lackadaisically or whatever. I wasn't sure. And so that was one of the things that I needed to make sure of was how much time did I actually have to deliver the talk? What's the audience? I already know GPS STEM, so that was pretty easy. And then what pieces of the story did I want to include? To give you an idea for this, at first I had like 60 slides. And then from there, I had to pick and choose the ones that I thought would be the most beneficial to share and then pare that down. And what we don't want to end up happening is that we have all these experiments, right? All this data that we have, everything that we've poured our whole life into, that we've just stayed up all night thinking about, oh crap, did I add in the right polymerase or whatever in my PCR? Like all that stuff, we don't want that to then turn into this pile of books here. Because when we think about the thesis, we think about that as one delivery, one talk, and it's just one very overarching synthesis of all of the data that you've collected. So how can we get all of this and make it into this glowing novel that just radiates sparkles? Right, that's kind of the theme for today's session. So here are the steps when we think about longer term prep. The first is attend talks. And when you take notes, but a lot of people take notes at talks, take notes on the delivery. Don't take notes on the actual content unless it's related to your field. But I can't remember like how many talks I went to as a grad student, as a postdoc. I took down notes on the content and I never looked at them again. It just didn't even occur to me to reopen that book. But because I know that in my current position, I needed to give a lot of talks. I would always make notes of, oh yeah, the way that this person told the story or the way this person phrased something, I really like that. And so I'd write it down. And I actually have my notebook here where I have like quotes from people that are really inspiring for me, at least when I'm preparing my talks, of how I want to put myself in the correct mindset to then deliver a good talk. Identify your story title. Select the data or the characters of your story. We want to build the background. So if you have characters in a story, it's not just enough to say, oh, well, this character was, I don't know, a fisher boat person, something like that, and then have that be it, right? We need a backstory, like, oh, this person grew up on the harbor, was actually born out on the harbor or something, and so had a fishing reel in their arms since the very beginning, and then from there, I don't know, learn how to talk to fish. I don't know, whatever. But like that whole context, that story, that background behind those characters, behind your data, is what's going to give your audience members context. If I just told you, for example, oh, we study synaptic zinc. For those of you who don't know the importance of synaptic zinc, that probably means nothing to you, right? But if I told you, well, synaptic zinc is released into the cleft, and it's really important because it can oligomerize with amyloid beta plaques, which is important for Alzheimer's. That gives you a little bit more context, right, behind why am I mentioning this little character in the first place. We have a facilitation plan. I'll show you exactly what that looks like, but every time I give a talk, and I'll show you on the big screen, but every time I give a talk, I always have my facilitation plan, which includes the slides here, and then a breakdown of the timeline here so that I know that I can stay on track, which right now we are actually pretty good, so I'm happy with that. Preparing for your I don't know answer. If you're giving your defense and somebody asks you a left ball question and you just say no, instead of saying I don't know, oftentimes what people are asking or what they're looking for in these types of questions, especially if they seem to have nothing to do with what you just presented, is they want to see how you think. They want to see how you think about certain topics, how you think about how do your experiments fit within the context that they're presenting. And they want to see how you can think like a scientist, how you can think like somebody who has a PhD. They want to see you not as the graduate student you are, but the academic professional or the industry professional that you're going to be, right? And those are some of the main reasons why they're going to ask you a lot of those questions that seem to have no sense whatsoever. But a good way to do it is say, I'm not entirely sure of the answer because those experiments haven't been done. However, given the context of what I know and the experiments that we have, it's possible that blah, 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 this is how it works. So preparing that I don't know answer, or at least the stem of that answer, can go a long way. Second to last one, practice out loud, time yourself. Don't overly do it, and definitely not the night before. But when we're thinking about months in advance, having that timing down really helps. There was a quote that I remember from, it was this educational talk, and the guy said, practice something not until you get it right, but until you can't do it wrong. And so that really resonated with me because if you were, for example, a heart surgeon, right? And you're like, you know what? I practiced this so much and I got it wrong a bunch, but I finally can do that triple bypass surgery. Let's go. As a patient, not really the most assuring thing, right? But if you're like, I've been doing this for 20 years, I could do this in my sleep, you might feel a little bit more comfortable being in that person's hands. And as a speaker, you want to make your audience members feel comfortable in the message that you want to deliver. And one of the ways you could do that is by practicing a lot so that you know the flow, you know the story, and you are confident in your preparation. We'll talk about what that looks like in a bit. Last, give feedback. Your PI is a great person to give feedback. They're also highly, highly biased about the story that they would like you to tell. So be sure that you try to get feedback from other people as well, especially on the delivery. As most of you probably know, PIs oftentimes are not the best people at giving talks. And so when we talk about the delivery of things, it's good to get various perspectives on it so that you can get multiple ideas. Actually, when I was preparing for mine, I gave a talk to my family who knew nothing about science. And I was like, what questions do you have? And those are the questions that I wanted to make sure that I addressed in the final version, because I knew that there were going to be people there who would have the same questions. And I didn't want to assume that everybody knew all of the answers to the basics. Okay, so when we think about the long-term prep, well, I want to take the next minute or two for you on your own to just think about a couple of things. The first is, when you think about your thesis, what is the title of your story? And what I'd like you to do is to not use too much jargon. So the question is, can someone without discipline-specific background understand? And I'll give you an example. I totally made this up, by the way. I don't know if actually this is true, but I literally just Googled what are the most complex immunological terms, and I smashed them all together in a sentence. So my own little ChatGPT. So here's an example. SV2A ameliorates cytokine-induced IL-6 adenosine deaminase positive receptor-mediated endocytosis. I mean, I know vaguely what some of that means, but not really. But if I were able to rephrase that, I could rephrase it to something like this. We're losing a little bit of detail here, but that's not important at this point. So we can rephrase it to be the beneficial effects of the synaptic receptor SV2A on the immune response. So as you can see, we don't mention anything about IL-6 or adenosine deaminase positive receptor-mediated endocytosis. That doesn't matter, because those are going to be the characters of the story. For the title, you don't list all of the characters in Avatar: The Last Airbender, right? You don't list every single person on there, right? Instead, we talk about the overarching things, and then the characters themselves will come later on in the details. So I want to give you about a minute or two to come up just with the title of your story on your own, and then we'll move on to. Okay, so that's time. If you want feedback on the title of your story, feel free to reach out, and I'm happy to take a look. But I want to show you real quick an example facilitation plan. This is the one that I actually have for today's talk, where I have exactly what parts we're going to be going through, how much time I'm allowing for each part, as well as the breakdown, because I know that we're starting at 12 and ending at 1. I want to make sure that, by the time we get to phase 3, I'm like, oh, we still have 400 slides to get through, and we've got 5 minutes to do it. All right, let's just blast through it. Want to avoid that at all costs. So every time I give a talk, I always have something like this where it breaks it down by the minute, so that way I know that I can stay on task. And it's been a tool that's helped me, especially because, like, for example, I teach a 3-hour course in the summer, Bio 99. I don't know if any of you have been TAs. If you are a TA for that, I am looking for TAs. But for a 3-hour course like that, it's like time is relative, like a construct at that point. And so by having some sort of a breakdown plan like this, it can keep me on task to make sure that I'm hitting all the points. But it's always important to leave time to adjust. For example, right now it's 12:36. We should be in phase 3. Now, I've done this enough that I know that I've built in time towards the end to allow for longer discussions, and that's totally fine. And so you want to make sure that you build in some time just in case discussions go very long, or for example, if we only have like 2 people show up, then this warm-up would have been very short, right? And to have those sorts of adjustments, it takes time to get that skill down, but once you do, it'll help very, very much. All right, any questions about phase 1? The long-term prep. All right. Phase 2 is the short-term prep, which I call the prologue. This is on the order of a day to hours before the talk. And there are a lot of things to keep in mind besides your thesis. Here are some of the common pitfalls: not getting enough sleep or food, not warming up, and also not trusting in your prep. You prepared for this, right, for months. You've got to believe in your preparation so that when you go and you deliver the talk, you're not worried about the details. Like I didn't have to worry about, I don't know, batteries in this thing. I already knew that I had that all prepped and ready to go. So trust yourself, trust in your prep. And here are the preparation steps. First is to choose your clothes carefully. If you are somebody who sweats profusely, you give a talk. Do not wear gray. It's the worst possible idea. Don't wear tight-fitting clothing. I mean, you'll see the pit stains. So choose your clothes carefully and dress for the weather. See if there's air conditioning. Who knows? Make sure you do that. Time your meals. You want to make sure that you're eating, a couple hours before. You want to eat directly before, especially if you get nervous because you're like, oh, I got a stomachache. None of that. Time your meals. Eat a couple hours before, and you're good to go. Get a good night's rest. Arrive early. Check the tech. So just like what I did when I came here, actually before I came here, I emailed Joanne and I said, what is the tech? And she told me, you've got a computer, here are the adapters that I have. So I knew kind of coming in exactly what was around, but I always like to prepare a couple extra things just in case. Like batteries, for example, this thing takes AAAs, and I know I didn't think that there were going to be AAA batteries here. There's not. And so I wanted to make sure to bring in the batteries. I also wasn't sure if that computer would be able to present from like a flash drive or whatever, which it's not if you want to use this anyway. So I had everything on a flash drive to load it up as well. So just making sure that you're familiar with the tech before you get there can go a long way. Prepare water. One of my pet peeves whenever I listen to a talk is when people are, especially on the microphone, you hear this all the time. It just gets to me. Like I have a visceral reaction to that. And a lot of times that happens because they're just simply not hydrated. Always prepare water. I've got my water bottle up there, which after doing that a few times, I'm going to take a sip in a bit. Use the bathroom. You don't want to run out halfway through and say, gotta pee. Use the bathroom beforehand. And then, as I said earlier, do your warm-ups, trust yourself. And speaking of warm-ups, I don't know if anybody watches the Olympics. This is Michael Phelps. So if you are not familiar with Michael Phelps, he is an Olympic swimmer who has won a bajillion medals in every single thing possible, probably even in running, I don't know. But he's a great swimmer. And so he has this warm-up routine. And I remember the first time I watched him, I was like, what is he doing? And I saw other swimmers kind of doing the same thing. I was like, oh, this is part of their warm-up. And this is like, we're going to be watching this until we're finished with the slide. This is his warm-up routine. He does it every single time before he swims. Just like that, for you, and my batteries are falling out here. For you, if you have a warm-up routine, you should practice that and be able to do it before your talk.
Don't do this in front of people.
If it helps, I mean, you go. So for example, for me, every time before I give a talk, I pace back and forth a few times. I loosen my arms up a bit because I like to use my arms and all these gestures. So I loosen up a little bit. And then on my way, when I'm walking to whatever venue I'm using to talk, I do a couple of vocal exercises. So things like any words that I know are going to trip me up, I'll practice. For example, in my thesis, one of the main things in my thesis was this drug called levetiracetam. Can't say it for the life of me if I don't practice. So on the way, like levetiracetam, oh crap, no, levetiracetam, all the way here, so that when I get here, I know exactly how it's supposed to come out of my mouth. So I want to ask, does anybody here have any weird warm-up routines like I just described before you either give a talk or before you do anything? Like an experiment, you like give yourself a pep talk or anything like that, safe space. But does anybody here have any sort of warm-up exercises that they like to share? Yes, go.
So I learned that we have face exercise. So basically, like try to relax and then straighten your muscle out in a weird way.
Yeah.
And then by doing that, you feel like, okay, your muscle is kind of relaxed and warmed up and you're ready to talk.
Yeah, that's great. Facial exercises, I've seen people go like this before they talk about. And I'm like, do you have something in your eye? But it actually helps them loosen up their facial muscles so that when they do go and give those talks, they're very loose. Was that a hand in the back? Nope. Yes? Nope. Okay.
No,
But,
what I
okay.
do, like stretching my body, like I'll go to the bathroom and like really stretch so that I'm in the talk. I have like a good position and like my chest is up and like I can use my hands.
Yeah, stretching is great, not only for those reasons, but it gets the blood moving as well. As you all might be aware, blood is very important for you to think, and stretching will definitely help you out with that. I saw hands somewhere around here.
I was
Yes.
gonna say, the power stance, a long time ago, someone told me that it helps just, so right before, I'll just stand there like this.
Yeah, so different power poses, they had their time. Some people still do them. I have not seen a lot of people go, like this right before a talk, but I do know that power poses do help, maybe not that exactly.
Maybe not with the legs, but yeah, with the arm.
Really? Just the arm? So you stand there just like this?
Yeah.
Face, face. Yeah, so something like that can go a long way. Yes.
I don't know what it's called, but I do what's called like bubbling. I think it helps with projecting your voice.
Yes, so you're essentially what you're doing is you're stretching out the vocal cords. And there are a couple different ways to do that. The way that I've learned is if you close your mouth and you try to do scales, then that helps a lot more than if your mouth is open. So if you close your mouth, go like all the way up and then back down, that will actually help stretch out the vocal cords a lot more than just saying things. Yes.
How now, brown cow, practice the consonants. How now, brown cow.
How now, brown cow?
Yeah.
Okay, is that similar to like Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers, that sort of thing? Okay. Yeah, these tongue twisters, right? But they're also a lot of fun. Good party trick. Yes.
My brain really races before anything, like even exams. So I like to actually meditate for 5 minutes right before and like calm down. Yeah, that's kind of what I do. Yeah.
I actually do that for really big talks that I have to give. So she said meditate a couple of minutes. So for example, right before I gave my job talk, I sat there, I just kind of closed my eyes, just centered myself. But again, kind of go, not that one, but kind of going through all the preparation steps, saying like, I'm ready, I trust myself, that sort of thing, before going into the talk. That helped out a lot. One more. Yes, in back.
Jumping off of the meditation, I usually listen to an intense song before and just to kind of get myself down into the mood. It relaxes me surprisingly, opposite to the energy.
Yeah, I love that. So listening to an intense song, he actually does that too, Michael Phelps. There's a, if you Google him and just say Michael Phelps, I don't know, face, I swear it'll pop up, like he's just sitting there with his hoodie on, he's like the whole time. But he's listening to like, I think he was listening to Eminem or something before he went into the water, and that can also put you in the right mood. Excellent warm-up steps. I love it all. I'm gonna steal a few of them, but hopefully those of you, if you don't have a warm-up routine, this will give you some ideas of things that can work for you. There's no shame in trying it in front of a mirror. Just make sure that it's not a public mirror unless you are very comfortable with yourself. Okay. So let's move on to the next, to the last couple of steps here, phases. The first is the delivery. This is the talk itself. So the time has come, you are up there at the podium, you look out and you said, okay, X amount of years of my life. This is it, let's do it. Here's the common pitfall, is forgetting the plan. You planned for this the whole time. And so remember the plan, stick to the plan, you've practiced, you've done your warm-ups, made a squeal, everything is good and you're good to go. And so when we think about the preparation for this, just remember, you are the one, you are the expert here. You're going to own your talk. You're the only one who can give it, and you're the only one who can deliver it in your style. And that makes it unique. You tell your story, be mindful of your posture, don't kind of, if you're going to be giving a talk, and unless you're not feeling well, and you're kind of like this the whole time, like you've got really bad indigestion. This is not going to be a good power pose, right, for you to actually deliver the talk itself. So be mindful of the talk, of your pacing as well. Make sure you're not going too fast. A good trick that I learned actually from my old supervisor, Brian Sato, was whenever he gets a lecture, he'll hold onto a cup of water. And whenever he feels like he's going too fast, he'll just pause and take a sip. Whenever he does that, that centers him a little bit, and it allows him to slow himself down so that he's not talking at a very rapid pace. Have confidence in your preparation. If you are comfortable, make eye contact. But if you're not, and I know a lot of people are not, a good trick is to aim like 4 inches above everyone's heads. Because if you do that, everybody will think that you're looking at them when really you're not, but they will have the illusion that you are actually giving them eye contact. So make sure that you are at least looking at the audience instead of just staying here the whole time and just looking at your screen like this. That doesn't, that's not good for your talk. Use gestures where appropriate. I like to use a lot of gestures, but don't be flailing around all over the place. I've seen that before. I'm part Italian, so my grandma does a lot. So every time she says, you have to put the meatball in sauce. So you don't need to do it quite like that, but a little bit of dynamicism does help out. That's a word. It does help. And then lastly, have backups. So for today, I always carry around my main set of batteries and a backup set of batteries. Even though Joanne told me that there's going to be a projector, I always bring my own adapter, and I always bring a marker just in case if the power went out, I could do this as a chalk rock. So I always like to come prepared with all the backups just in case. Now we're going to move on and transition to this last part, and we are right on time. So this last part is about the post-delivery. This is what I like to call the epilogue. So when we think about the delivery, the post-delivery, a lot of times people don't actually think about it at all, which is it's really a missed opportunity. So not handling the questions appropriately and not communicating things. Two of the more common things that I've seen in talks. When we prepare for this, whenever you're asked the question, please repeat it. Especially like, let's say you were asking me a question up here and you were like using your stock voice because we're just talking one-on-one. Chances that somebody back there is going to hear is close to zero, right? So whenever you're asked the question, even though that person might assume that they can project their voice, it's always good to repeat. It gives you time to think, gives you time to form the context, and it gives you time to form your answer. Repeat the questions. As I said before, prepare those I don't know answers, maintain your eye contact, stay confident, and then also just wrap it up. You're done. You've finished your talk. You nailed all those questions out, smile, you're done. You're good to go. The last impression that you give at a talk is just as important as the first impression, because that last impression is going to be what they're going to be thinking about as the day goes on, or as, I don't know, life goes on. So you want to make sure that you have a really good last impression as well. And then as always, you want to thank the audience. Oh, thank you so much for coming and blah, blah, blah. Show that gratitude. Again, that helps the connection to connect with the audience. You want to be sure to do that. Okay, when we think about the timeline, to bring it all back, right? These are the 4 phases. If we think about the story, the research, the preparation, the prologue, which is the short-term, immediately before the talk, the story itself, that delivery, and the epilogue, the post-delivery prep. I want to give you an example of what this looks like, and I'll give you an example from my own thesis. So this was the title of my story. Levetiracetam prevents age-related cognitive impairment in a sex-specific manner in mice lacking synaptic zinc. If you knew nothing about science, you might be able to pick out some words here like, oh, age-related cognitive impairment, I kind of know what that means. And if you know a little bit about science, then some of these other words might make a little bit more sense to you. And if you're my PI, then you'd be like, I know exactly what that means. So it kind of spans all of the different audiences that I wanted to hit. So the characters of my story, these are all the experiments that I ran as a grad student. No way in hell would all of that fit into a 60-minute talk, right? So because of that, I had to pick and choose the characters that would tell the story. I narrowed it down to 5. I narrowed it down to behavior, EEG, neurogenesis, LTP, and some mRNA. Everything else, it didn't add to the story in a meaningful way, so I decided I'm just not going to talk about it. If they had questions, I had slides that I could show them and say, oh, it's great that you asked that. I actually have the data. But I knew that it wouldn't serve the main purpose. And if I added all those things in, I'd be rapid fire the whole way, trying to talk about, I don't even know how many things are there, 13, I think. It's just too much. So pick out the characters that will serve the story. So here are the characters, 5 of them there. And then I thought about, okay, now what is the background that's needed for people to understand what this story actually means? So the big picture here, cognitive impairment. I wanted to make sure that this was actually in the story title, because the big idea, the big picture has to be in the story title. That's what I want to convey. Why did I choose levetiracetam, this drug here? I needed to explain that because not a lot of people are familiar. What are the current applications of this drug? This is what it's used for. This is what people think it does. It does, yes. What are the proposed applications? Why are we using mice that are lacking synaptic zinc? If you're not in the field, might not be familiar with the model. So why did we choose them? And then all of that background led to the hypothesis linking Lev to why we use these mice. So we have the background, we have the hypothesis, we have the characters, but now I want to actually form the story. And if you listen to novelists, actually, this is how they approach creating and writing stories itself. So here are the characters. The first one, behavior. I know that Lev reduces age-related cognitive impairment, but how does it do that? Well, that brings us to the next character, EEG. We know that it's not through electroencephalography, it doesn't reduce spiking. So what was the next step in that story? It makes sense that it would have been because it's an anti-epileptic drug, but that's not how it works. Well, let's take a look. So we did an mRNA screen. We looked at the mRNA and we tried to see what was going on, what genes were affected. And then from there, we can test it out and say, well, look, we have genes related to LTP and neurogenesis. Let's talk about it. So in neurogenesis, we saw sex-specific traits, again, related to the title. And then from there, we saw LTP, we actually saw opposing effects there. So we know that they actually work differently depending on if the mice were male or if the mice were female. And how those two actually interact was the key part of the story. And so what we did was we brought that back together to the actual title. So levetiracetam prevents age-related cognitive impairment in sex-specific manner in mice lacking synaptic zinc. If you look at all the characters here, each one of these will play a role in the story itself. And so that's that final check, is to make sure that all of the characters in your story are actually contributing in a meaningful way. So that when you deliver the talk, deliver the story, tell that story, that all of it is kind of cohesive, tied up in a nice little bow, and then you can submit that to your committee and then take your bow. So that's kind of the example when I was giving my talk of how I framed the story, chose the characters, and then framed how the outline and how the chapters were going to go in order for me to cohesively tell that story. All right, are there any questions about either the story, the process, any of the phases, the preparation? Yes.
I have a question about choosing your audience. So given that it'll be like your PI and then people in your field and people who know your field but might not be as technical, and then like family members and stuff, is there a way that you can cater to everyone, or like should you focus on being less technical for the sake of the public, or how do you find that balance?
Yeah, so the question is about the audience. How do you, if you have an audience who is not technical, if you have ones that are your part of your lab, your PI, your committee, how do you cater to all of them? There are a couple of different strategies. The first is to consider whether or not you're going to have a closed door defense as well, right? If you have a closed door defense, save all the technical stuff for the closed door defense, and then leave all of the kind of higher level stuff to the public defense. If you don't have a closed door defense, then I would err on the side of keeping it more general, but having the data to back it up. That way, everybody who doesn't have like a degree in whatever field you're in, they'll know what you're talking about. But those people, especially committee members, later on, they'll say, hey, well, I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on this data. You already have that, like it's a backup slide or whatever. Sure, yeah, I can do that. But that doesn't factor into the actual details of the story itself. Just show the data that's necessary for you to tell the story and leave all the details as supplemental. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Yes.
So I find a hard time to opening the talk and then closing the talks. Do you have like good phrases for opening and closing?
Yeah, so the question is about opening and closing talks, and those are the hardest parts because that's the first impression and the last impression. It depends on your personality. For me, I'm a little goofy and I love humor, so I try to infuse as much of that into the opening and closing as I possibly can. Not to overdo it, of course, because that can also go off the rails, but just stay true to yourself and then kind of dive right into it. I think the important part, especially when you're opening, is the delivery, is like, how do you present yourself? How are you proposing if you decide to, or how do you project your voice? Those are the sorts of things that will get the audience hooked. I've seen some people be very successful at questions. So for example, like, did you know that X million of people suffer from Alzheimer's disease every year? Or, something, the grand statement like that. I've seen that happen. And that's been pretty good. To add that hook. I don't know if you said it, but somebody else was saying that a hook is very important for the story. And you can start off with that. And then at the end, I always, for every single talk I do, I always bring it back to the beginning and say like, these were the goals, or like, this was the framework, these were the outlines, and this is where I took you in this journey from here to here. And so that way you can very nicely just wrap everything back up and bring it back to the beginning, as stories often do. Does that answer your question? Great, yes.
So can I help answer that? Because not everybody here came to the overview, talk about how to give talks. And at the end, it's really useful to have a visual, schematic of what you just talked about in the context of literature. And that automatically brings things back to the beginning. And another point from the beginning is never read the title of your talk. Even Matt's talk, which he included some lay people's words, just say, today I'm going to tell you about my thesis work. We're really interested in age-related memory loss and the possible role of saying whatever, just something that's not reading from the slide. I'm going to just leave the room if I hear somebody give it start and read their title. It just really bothers me and many people. So that is, your goal isn't to read to people what they can read themselves. Just start conversationally about why this is interesting. And then you could say, we all know somebody or many people with Alzheimer's disease, or we've all had family and friends die of cancer. Immediately everybody's going to be listening and interested. So that's my suggestion and Melissa Ladon's suggestion for how to, start your talk. Don't read the title, talk about something everybody feels.
I hope I didn't read the title here.
You didn't.
Right, like someone is already gonna read your title and introduce you, so like
Yeah.
just repeating it just.
And it's also a waste of time, right? Like if you've got a certain amount of real estate in a talk, you don't want to spend on repeating something that everybody already knows or somebody's already said before. Yeah. Yes.
I have a question about the transition between slides.
Hmm?
What is the best way to translate between slides?
Are you talking about a physical transition or like a conceptual transition?
I mean, when you want to talk about your next slide, right?
Mhm.
All right, like, what is the best way? Am I going to say, oh, next, or how to introduce the next slide?
I see. So the question is about slide transitions. So if you were going to talk about one thing and then you wanted to transition to the next, how could you actually do that? By the way, David, we have some people in the chat. I was told not to handle the chat, but I don't know if you could answer those questions or address that. For me, when I think about slide transitions, I always think about it in terms of a story. And if there's really no good transition, then what I like to do is insert an outline slide. And say, like, for example, if you have 3 different experiments and all of them, like, they don't fit together in a cohesive story, just have an outline and say, all right, here's what we're going to talk about. And then here's the first story I'm going to tell. Here's the second story I'm going to tell. Here's the third story. And then between those transitions, you can show the outline and say, okay, we're finished with the first part. We're going to move on to the second part now. If there's a natural progression, that's always going to be better. One of the strategies that I've used is through the slide titles. So every slide title I have will have elements of the slide before it in the title. So that way there's linking transition words between the slides. And that can often help with the flow. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's one strategy that I've used. Yes.
What is the best way to split up your time during your thesis talk? Like how much time should you spend on background versus the conclusion versus the actual when you're presenting your data?
Yeah, so the question is about how do we split our time? And we're almost at 1, so this will be the last question, then I can answer any questions afterwards. So in general, for a public defense, I would spend, let's assume that you have an hour. I would probably spend maybe 5 to 10 minutes, maybe 5 minutes on the actual background before you get into the data. But every time you present a piece of data, I would also be giving a little bit of background to give the context. So if you were to give, for example, I'm going to talk about neurogenesis. Why is neurogenesis so important? Here's a minute of background there before getting into neurogenesis and the data itself. The data, so I would have the bulk of it be the data, so maybe like 30 minutes or so, and then maybe 5 minutes, if that, of future directions, and then just thank the audience, leaving about 5 to 10 minutes for Q&A. But that depends on what your PI wants, as well as how long you have for the defense. But for me, it's all about, it's not just here's the background, materials and methods. It's not a paper, right? So I always like to include the background as the data goes on. So it's kind of this cascading effect. Hope that answers your question.
So a lot of people have many chapters in their thesis that they're not always clearly connected, and you're tempted to show it all, to show off everything you've done. Story is so important. So pick 1 chapter or 2 that are related, tell the story and say, if I had more time, I would tell you about other aspects of my thesis. We'll talk about it in the private defense. Adhere to a good story.
And stay on time. Stay on time. And with that, we're at lunch. If you have any questions, I'll stick around for a few minutes, but otherwise, have a good rest of your day.